Well, thank you very much, Victoria, for the introduction. Both Jon Kher and myself are very pleased to be here today, finally, to be able to talk about our urbanization flagship report for the South Asia region on leveraging urbanization, how to make urbanization work better in terms of both the prosperity and livability of cities is really the focus of the report. So just a little bit of background. This is a report which we launched in New Delhi last September. The launch of the report was led by our then Managing Director, Shriya Mulyani. She's recently left the bank to go back to Indonesia to become Finance Minister of the country. And this is the World Bank's third flagship report for the South Asia region. The first report was on jobs, the second on inequality. This report is on urbanization. And the topic of the report is really chosen based upon what seemed to be most important for policymakers in the region at that particular time. And really the launch of the report marked the climax of a 2-year effort by the South Asia Urban team within the bank to build a better understanding of patterns of urban and spatial transformation within South Asia, and also the links between these patterns and the key outcomes of prosperity and livability across cities in the region. So we do have some copies of the report here, just a limited number, but we can get some more copies if need be. But to provide a brief overview of the structure of the report, basically the report is split into two main sections. So the first part of the report is really diagnostic. It provides original empirical analysis of patterns of urbanization and structural transformation within South Asia. And then the second part of the report really switches gear to talk about policies, building upon the diagnostic analysis of part 1 of the report, to see how we might achieve better outcomes, again in terms of these two key outcomes of prosperity and livability of cities. So in terms of the presentation today, I'll start off. I'll talk about the first part of the report, present some highlights in terms of the main findings, and then pass over to Jon Kher, who will talk about the policy side of things in that sense. Okay, so let's start off by looking at the first part of the report, talking about patterns of urbanization, structural transformation within South Asia. For those of you who aren't familiar with the World Bank's definition of South Asia, it basically contains 8 countries. And the biggest country is, of course, India, but there's also Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. So we do have a real variety of countries within the region, from Maldives, obviously a very small state, to India, which dominates the region in terms of population. But if we step back and look at the region overall, the first and most obvious thing to notice about the urbanization process is just the sheer scale of the number of people that have been added to towns and cities recently. So if we look at the period 2000 to 2011, towns and cities in the region have added 130 million people. Now, to put that number into context, 130 million people is equivalent to the entire population of Japan, the world's 7th most populous country. And if we look forward over the next 15 years, then this large absolute increase in urban population is forecast to continue, perhaps even accelerated. So between 2015 and 2030, it's projected that the region will add a further 250 million people to its urban areas, approximately equivalent to Indonesia's entire population. So this really is a tidal wave of urban population increase. And so the basic message in the report, which we talk about on the policy side, is that there's an opportunity to be able to leverage this urbanization to produce better outcomes, better development outcomes in terms of prosperity and livability. But in order to realize this kind of opportunity, then there needs to be some policy reforms in that context. Now, along with this huge increase in urban population in absolute terms, the region has seen some very notable progress. So there's been a process of structural transformation occurring within the region, so much so that now 80% of GDP in the region is produced outside of the agricultural sector by manufacturing and services. There's also been some quite impressive growth of GDP per capita in the region. Between 2000 and 2012, GDP per capita on average grew by 56%. Also a marked decline in the incidence of extreme poverty in the region. Back in 1999, 1 in 2 people lived on less than $1.25 per day, the old kind of benchmark for extreme poverty. However, fast forward to 2010, and that number is down to 1 in 3 people. And if we look at all subnational districts across the 8 countries in South Asia, it's really telling that we see a significant negative relationship between how urbanized a district is and the rates of extreme poverty observed in that district. So we do seem to see these beneficial associations between how urbanized the place is, how urbanized the district is, and the rate of poverty within that district. And from the academic literature, we also know that there have been positive growth spillovers occurring from urban areas to surrounding rural areas. So we have some evidence for India, also for Nepal, for example. And Martin Ravalian, I think, has just published some new evidence for India on the kind of nexus between urbanization and poverty reduction, showing beneficial impacts in India in that context. Now, despite this progress, we do see that urbanization nevertheless remains underleveraged in some respects. And so symptomatic of this is if we look at globally at the relationship between levels of GDP per capita of countries on the vertical axis and the level of urbanization on the horizontal axis. A notable thing here is that we measure urbanization not using the standard kind of national definitions of urban, which differ from country to country, but using the agglomeration index, which is a measure of urbanization which is constructed to be consistent, a consistent definition of urban areas across countries. So what we see in South Asia is, given the levels of agglomeration, levels of GDP per capita tend to be below what we would expect or predict in that sense. So most countries within the region, particularly the big countries, are below the trend line in this graph. And the only 2 real exceptions in the region are Bhutan and, to a lesser extent, Sri Lanka. These 2 countries have done quite well in terms of bucking the trend of underperformance within the region. And if we turn to livability, we see that there is still plenty of scope for improving the livability of cities. And this is something we see when we look, for example, at global rankings of cities according to the levels of livability. Now, there exist several such rankings. One of the more kind of well-known rankings is the Economist Intelligence Unit's livability rankings. The EIU rank 140 countries, cities globally, according to the level of livability. And we see out of those 140 cities, the highest ranked South Asian city is New Delhi at 110th. And if we look at Dhaka, Dhaka comes in next to bottom in these rankings. According to the IU in 2015, the only place less livable than Dhaka in the rankings was Damascus in Syria. So I think that says a lot. We also see, although there's been lots of progress on urban poverty reduction, rates of urban poverty do nevertheless remain high within the region. In the most extreme case of Afghanistan, more than 1/4 of people living in towns and cities live below the national poverty line. Furthermore, 130 million South Asians live in poorly serviced informal settlements. And South Asian cities are really notorious, I guess, for the very high levels of pollution. And so we see that when it comes to concentrations of PM2.5 and PM10, particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less in the atmosphere of the cities in that respect. And so just looking a little bit more closely at this relationship between levels of air pollution and the population density of cities, then if we take a sample of 381 developing country cities globally, we see that there's a positive relationship between the population density of the city and the level of PM2.5, after controlling for other environmental factors and climatic factors. But what's notable is that for South Asian cities, a given increase in population density is associated with a bigger increase in the level of PM2.5. So there seems to be something different going on for South Asian cities that lead to bigger increases in pollution as these cities become more dense. So there's a very interesting kind of sustainability kind of dimension to discuss here. Now, if we step back and think a little bit more kind of analytically in some respects about the determinants of kind of performance at the city level, in terms of our two key outcomes of prosperity and livability of cities, we really see these two key outcomes as being the result of the interaction of agglomeration economies. Agglomeration economies are basically the productivity benefits associated with urban city size, urban density. You tend to get better knowledge spillovers, you have thicker labour markets that lead to better matching between workers and employers. You have a greater local variety of local suppliers. And so these things tend to boost productivity, boost prosperity. However, acting against these agglomeration economies, we have various types of congestion forces. And these congestion forces come not only from the pressure of urban population on local transport infrastructure, on the roads, on local transport, but much more generally, the pressure of urban population on land markets, the pressure on housing markets, the pressure on all types of basic urban infrastructure, and the pressure on the environment. And so these congestion forces tend to act as a dampener on prosperity, livability. And so one of the central arguments of the report is that failures not only of the markets but of policy have tended to exacerbate these congestion forces, leading to weaker outcomes in terms of prosperity and livability of cities. And so tackling these congestion constraints is really part of the story in terms of how to improve prosperity and livability of cities. Now, just to digress slightly, just talking about congestion. Well, successful cities also do tend to be very congested cities in a sense. So you're never going to get rid of congestion of cities. And we really do see that with world-class cities like London, Hong Kong, Singapore, New York. All of these cities have, maybe with the exception of Singapore when it comes to traffic congestion, high levels of traffic congestion. Also, they tend to rank amongst some of the world's most expensive property markets because of the pressure of demand in those cities. And so if we look at traffic in downtown London today, it tends to move at about the same speed as it did in the late 19th century, when horse-drawn carriages, rather than cars, dominated the streets. But what we see in these kind of world-class cities is that firms, people, households, they're kind of willing to bear these congestion costs because of the strength of agglomeration economies. By contrast, in South Asia, what we see is high congestion costs exacerbated by various policy dimensions and balancing agglomeration economies at much lower levels of productivity analytically. Also a much wider array of congestion forces. So it's not just the property markets, it's not just the congestion of the streets, but more generally infrastructure pressure on basic urban services. Now, in terms of these congestion forces, as I've mentioned, there are kind of several different sources of them. And within the region, these congestion forces have helped give rise to what we characterize as being a pattern of messy and hidden urbanization in the report. So let me talk a little bit about messy urbanization, first of all. So we've already seen that there's a very large urban slum population in the region, 130 million people at a conservative estimate, living in poorly serviced informal settlements. But there's also widespread sprawl, particularly on the peripheries of major cities in the region. And this is something we see using the nighttime lights data, which is something we use extensively in the report in our kind of diagnostics. So if we look at the nighttime lights data, we're able to define basically the urban footprint of a city or the urban extent of a city. And so between 1999 and 2010, we see that these urban footprints grew approximately twice the speed of urban population overall in the region. So this mirrors some of Solly Angel's earlier findings for a global sample of cities. But it's important to note there is heterogeneity within the region. So the picture for Pakistan looks rather different to the picture for India. In a sense, Indian cities do seem to have been sprawling more on the peripheries than, for example, Pakistani cities, although it's still, as Jon will talk about, an issue in Pakistan. Now, along with this kind of rapid growth on the peripheries of cities and the kind of sprawl that's been occurring, for most of the kind of major metropolitan cities in the region, we also see this kind of rapid growth on the periphery being accompanied by some degree of stagnation at the cores of these cities. Again, this is something we see with this nighttime lights data. The kind of intensity of nighttime lights is thought to be a good proxy for kind of the level of economic activity, and therefore being able to pick up patterns of kind of GDP growth, a refined spatial level. And so, for example, if we look at Dhaka, which is the left image on this particular slide, then the red area kind of around Dhaka shows rapid growth of nighttime lights, rapid economic growth. But if we look at the center of Dhaka, it's kind of blue, and this blue captures a kind of stagnation, even a slight dimming of nighttime lights over this time period. So we've got very strong core periphery patterns of growth, kind of stagnation at the center, rapid growth on the periphery. And part of this, we argue, is kind of congestion forces pushing activity out of the city more towards peripheral areas. The image on the right shows a very similar pattern, core periphery pattern for Karachi. We see similar patterns, for example, for Mumbai, for Delhi. Two cities which kind of buck this trend in the region are Bangalore. Bangalore, you see strong growth at the center of the city, strong growth on the periphery. And the second example is Colombo in Sri Lanka, which is really one of the cities that's done very well comparatively in those terms. Now, we see these core periphery patterns of growth as being linked to a certain extent to a trend of formal manufacturing, moving out of the kind of major metropolitan areas to more suburban areas. I mean, of course, this is a phenomenon we've witnessed in the US, in the UK, in most developed countries. But it's a process that's been occurring at South Asia, a much lower level of development comparatively. So occurring at like $2,000–3,000 per capita instead of at $10,000 per capita, if we look at the kind of level of development. And so formal manufacturing has been moving out of the major Indian metropolitan cores to more kind of suburban locations. If we look at the garment manufacturing industry in Dhaka, which is really the dominant kind of manufacturing industry in the country, we see a suburbanization of this garment manufacturing industry to precisely the places where we've seen the kind of rapid nighttime lights growth in the image. And Colombo, to a lesser extent, some decline in specialization in manufacturing. But the thing that kind of distinguishes Colombo, say, from Dhaka or some of the major Indian cities, is that Colombo has been relatively successful in kind of transitioning land in core urban areas to higher value land uses. So kind of trading up to higher value added activities as the manufacturing is decentralized. And so, as I said, Colombo is a little bit different in terms of its nighttime lights pattern. It's not so much kind of dimming at the periphery, it's been more vibrant at the periphery in the nighttime lights data. Now, as we've seen this kind of expansion of urban areas on the periphery, kind of rapid growth in the periphery, much of this kind of rapid growth has actually been in areas which are formally classified as rural. And from an administrative perspective are governed, not as urban areas, but rural areas. And so here we see this for Sri Lanka. This is other tri-temporal nighttime lights image for Sri Lanka. Now, the thing to really focus on here is the area which is red in the image. So the red shows nighttime lights which existed in 2012, but not in 2002. So it's kind of new areas where lights are appearing in the country. And you can see that the growth is all on the periphery of the Colombo metropolitan region, going down along the coast to the south to the cities of Galle and Matra. And I mean, most of this growth, again, is kind of in areas that the country officially classifies as rural. There's also been a very marked urban development within Sri Lanka. If you notice, a lot of the red tends to follow major roads, major highways. And so we have this pattern of urban development, kind of sprawling development. And so this is the hidden urbanization, places that continue to be classified as rural, governed as rural, nevertheless becoming more urban in the character, in a sense. And the extent of this hidden urbanization seems to be much more widespread in South Asia compared to all the major regions of the world. And so that's one notable difference between, for example, East Asia and South Asia, according to our metrics of the degree of hidden urbanization. And so this obviously brings governance challenges. Now, along with this kind of expansion of cities on the periphery, we've seen a related phenomena, kind of the rise of multi-city agglomerations. How do we define a multi-city agglomeration? Well, in this report, I mean, there's many ways we could define it, but we define a multi-city agglomeration as a kind of continuously lit belt of urbanization that contains at least two major cities, each of which has a population of at least 100,000 people. So a good example of the emergence of kind of one of these multi-city continuous belts of urbanization is Coimbatore in the south of India. So if we look at the green area on the map, that's basically the urban footprints in 1999, and the kind of pink-purple area is the urban footprint in 2010. So in 1999, Coimbatore kind of had its own separately identifiable urban footprint. However, fast forward to 2010, the urban footprint has come to merge with that of some other nearby cities, a small pre-existing kind of multi-city agglomeration. Again, given this more continuous belt of urbanization in that part of India. More generally, if we look at the 8 countries in the region overall, the number of these multi-city agglomerations has increased from 37 in 1999 to 45 in 2010. And so we're getting increasingly interconnected networks of cities to some extent. This process is well underway in India, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka. It's much less advanced in Nepal, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. The cities still look much more isolated, perhaps not unexpectedly given the levels of development in those countries. Now, perhaps the kind of most striking example of this sort of continuous belt of urbanization that we're kind of seeing emerge within the region is if we look at the Delhi-Lahore corridor, almost. So in 1999, Lahore, Delhi, the urban footprints, the separate agglomerations, the urban footprints don't connect in any way. Fast forward to 2010, and the urban footprints kind of touch at the tips, round about AMRUT. And so, you know, it's really notable that even given this sort of highly impermeable border between the two countries, we're kind of seeing this belt of continuous urbanization, which is kind of forming to some extent. And so you can imagine, given greater regional integration, the kind of opportunities for kind of leveraging this, it seems almost a natural kind of belt of urbanization in that sense. So with that, I'll kind of bring to a close talking about some of the highlights from part 1 of the report, the diagnostic, and then pass over to Jon Kher, who will talk about the much harder issue of what to do in terms of policies to address messy, hidden urbanization, the congestion constraints of cities.
Thank you, Mark. So I hope that was a very good overview of where we're coming from in terms of the high-level analytics that fed into the report. I'm going to sort of talk a little bit more at a smaller scale. So you see a change in the type of slides I'll be using. Instead of plans, we're going to zoom down a little bit on cities and what we can do to tackle congestion constraints in South Asia. So one of the big messages that come out of the report in order to kind of leverage on cities is to improve to improve on connectivity and planning. So connectivity, I mean connectivity between cities. You want a system of cities. It's no longer just focusing on individual cities, but it's how cities are actually connected together to improve basically the flow of goods and people and passing through different cities, and to connect them as a whole system. So connectivity also improves a lot of access to markets, and it drives growth and spatial clusters. For example, in this chart, you see growth is concentrated. This is of Pakistan. If we look at the nighttime lights, which you might have seen earlier, it's actually very bright in Pakistan. A lot of it is actually showing how the roads are actually connected between cities. So, you know, that's an example of what I mean by good connectivity between cities. And growth is primarily driven by access to markets, which produce proximity and access to transport infrastructure, which are very important in creating this system of cities. So this is light intensity in 1999 for Pakistan. And then if you look at 2010, that's really an increase in the brightening of highways and roads within Pakistan, showing that connectivity and that correlation between economic activity as well. In terms of planning, there's also a need to really think about how we address housing shortages. This is a chart that actually shows slums and informal settlements that are not only just occupied by the urban poor, but also middle-income households. And there's really a very big shortage of housing needs in South Asian cities, and these needs to be really addressed. So for example, in India alone, we're looking at a backlog of 18 million housing in 2010. And this doesn't even account for the future growth of India. And underlying some of these planning and connectivity issues, it's really how urban governance and finance can be enhanced. So in the report, you'll find 3 deficits we've addressed, looking at how empowerment of cities can be improved, because today there's really a lot of overlapping and fragmented and functional assignments between the central, state, and local governments. There's also a resource deficit in terms of financing, very limited revenue powers, and also very ill-conceived intergovernment transfer systems. And to kind of support these 2 deficits, you also need to think about the accountability deficits, how these can be incorporated into urban governance, a very important pillar for planning and connectivity. So some examples of what cities are doing. You're probably familiar with the India Smart Cities as a program to kind of focus on cities that will improve on capacity, on spatial planning, and the way cities are actually managed. So not just between cities connectivity, you also need to look at cities internally, so intra-city connectivity. A good example is in Ahmedabad, where the BRT system has really shaped the city in making it more compact and also improving the mobility between different districts within cities, access to jobs, and basically improving the general livability of the city.
This photograph came from Narendra Modi's own website?
I think so, yes. I was trying to look for a good photograph, but we didn't. Surprisingly, it's actually very difficult to find a photograph of the BRT system that actually looks at the different elements. Yeah.
It's a good place to find.
Yeah. And this is an example from Ahmedabad, where there are plans to actually think about how you can rejuvenate the city core. I'll talk a little bit more about city centers, because these are very important components of South Asian cities, as you saw from the slides that Mark presented. A lot of the cities that we deal with have dimming cores, meaning that the vibrancy within cities is declining. And I think that's really an opportunity to think about how some of these cities can be rejuvenated from not just looking at the periphery where you plan for housing and managing growth, but also within the city cores. There needs to be some focus in looking at the centers of cities. In Ahmedabad, for example, there's really plans to see how we can not only improve double the street network, but also increase the density. This is also a tool that, where I come from, Singapore is very successful. We think about mechanisms to really increase the density, provide for jobs, and kind of looking also into urban design and shaping the city core into a more vibrant environment to support businesses and livability. So, again, just to reiterate what Mark has been showing you, a lot of cities we see some cities we see in South Asia have dimming cores, and that's really an opportunity to think about what we can do within cities, not just the periphery. And this is Karachi. I'm going to talk a little bit about more, because a lot of the work that we've done has actually translated into actual operational work in some of these cities, and we're currently engaged in looking at how we can improve Karachi at this moment. So Karachi, this shows very large areas of the city center dimming over the period of 1999 to 2010. And actually, if we look closer into some of the issues at the city level, you can kind of understand why this is so. So this is a land use map that we got with the help of the European Space Agency. What we did was to take high resolution imagery, and then through some algorithm, we were able to identify areas that were classified as residential, commercial, or infrastructure, for example. But one thing that's surprising about Karachi, which I'm going to use as a case example to kind of talk a little bit more about issues, is the prevalence of the areas in pink. These are actually classified as construction sites. So if you zoom in into Karachi on Google Maps, you will see that these areas, they have road grids, but they're under construction. So a lot of land, even in the center of Karachi, on the waterfront, is classified as construction. And if you think about it, in 2013, that's 13 years later, that area is still under construction. So when you talk about cities that don't have land, that's not necessarily always true. There's land that's occupied by military cantonments, or land that's occupied by ports, or land that are, in this case, just under construction. And the reason for a lot of this land not being fully utilized is because in Karachi, for example, there are 18 land-owning agencies that do not coordinate. Some of these agencies are at the provincial level, some of them at the city level, and some of them are also at the federal level. And very different programs, development, they don't talk to each other, and that has resulted in a spatial structure that is not very efficient. So from the previous presentation, we see that one of the key things South Asian cities need to do is think about how they can leverage on their spatial structure to really promote productive and livable outcomes. So again, zooming into this as a case study, just to highlight how unsustainable some of this spatial structure is, you see leapfrogging that's happening outside the city in terms of the growth between 2001 and 2013. You see periphery growth, which is normal, but I think if you can start planning for this and how you can also accommodate housing and needs of urban population growth, which is very important. And what do you do with the city center is also equally as important, because these are the areas that will start to define the city. They are also the central business districts, and also where people find jobs and jobs are located. So moving towards a prosperous and livable Karachi, we've recommended, these are some recommendations that we gave in our last mission to Karachi, talking about, again, city leadership, how there is a need to coordinate metropolitan planning, to think about alleviating congestion, thinking long-term, not just looking what the immediate needs are, but also planning for the future, looking at the structure plan, thinking about how revenues and expenditure are being used efficiently. And a big component is also about consultation and inclusion. Having worked in Karachi, it's a very complicated political economy there, and to actually have that, to plan the city, there needs to be a lot of communications and consultations with private businesses and also with civil society. Today, if you start doing anything in cities, mayors, they have to actually be very consultative in that approach. You can't just come in and say, let's do plan a city and just implement roads without actually having that consultation element. And this is coming also from experience. I've worked in Singapore as an urban planner for 10 years, and increasingly that is also very, very important in terms of shaping cities. So the process. We're also looking into how we can improve public spaces. This was a big agenda in the recent Habitat 3 in Quito a few weeks back. So the areas in black are the areas that are for residential, for businesses, but the areas in white, which are streets, plazas, parks, are areas that often city administrators or planners tend to forget, because these not only generate congestion, so you need to manage congestion on the streets, but they're also areas that are owned by the city. They're public assets, which can also help to improve the livability of cities. You saw the ranking of most South Asian cities. They're very low, and these offer an opportunity for cities to kind of look into how to rejuvenate and to improve the way cities are planned and shaped. This is a photo I took in a city called Kandy. Kandy is a secondary city in Sri Lanka. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So when I was asked to work on Kandy, I was really happy, work on a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And if you Google Kandy on the internet, you see these very nice images of trees and a lake and a historic temple. But then when you visit cities on the ground, the city on the ground, it's the opposite. It's overcome with congestion. the photo on the left, it's a lady walking on a track, because as we were getting into the city, roads were completely overtaken by, sidewalks were actually overtaken by traffic. And to actually get in the city, you had to walk on the tracks to get to the city, and this is a live track. So when the train comes, you have to scoot off the tracks, and then you get back on and you continue walking in the city, which was really very dangerous. So the World Bank is currently engaged in Candy, thinking about how we can reorganize traffic to improve city livability and the way cities are shaped, thinking about how areas where land can be freed up for other users as well, which is hopefully in the next few years we'll see a big transformation for the city. And these are not big mega cities, but these are also the medium-sized cities. So this is a city of about 200,000 people. So some on-the-ground photos. So examples of some cities that are also have managed to kind of transform the city center, not just managing the periphery. Places like Colombo. This used to be a government office, which was then freed up for public users, retail facilities, and for the general public. Medellin in Colombia is a very good example of how the city has also looked into investing in public amenities that has completely transformed the city. The city used to be known for its crime. It used to be a capital for crime, they call it. But today it's known as the city for life. Completely changed. And if you look at some of the investments that sort of shaped the city or changed the city, things like investments in the cable car, providing access to slum areas, investing in very good public spaces. These are in the slum areas as well. You know, again, many good examples in other cities and countries that have successfully changed from very dilapidated urban space within city centers to think about new and innovative ways that can really transform cities. So these are just examples of what can happen. Some of them are in South Asia, others are not. But it's something that the World Bank is also working with different city mayors and governments to think about as well. We are receiving actually a lot of requests to think about how we can rejuvenate city centers, and that's something we're working on as well. So again, back to Karachi. This is a live project. How to transform Karachi from inside out, looking at the city core and improving the municipal services and urban spaces from within. So moving towards a more prosperous and livable city is really a few things that we can think about. How do you manage congestion pressures, both current and future pressures of having more people in cities? Underlying that is how do you improve urban governance and finance? How do you manage sprawl and expansion? And also a focus on the city center and not give up on it. Most people think that that's where it's overly congested and let's focus elsewhere. We also have started a series of knowledge exchange events, and we call it a practitioners network to look at some of these issues. So thank you very much.